So just one more thing I wanted to mention about Florence Nightingale's impact before we move on. I mentioned that it has a direct effect on the United States as well. So the Crimean War is in the 1850s, as you can see, and the American Civil War was in the 1860s. And if you've studied US history, or maybe not, maybe you're going to study it next year, but you may be aware that there's a significant number of women who also make a name for themselves as nurses during the American Civil War, and the Red Cross is also founded as a result of the US Civil War. So you can kind of see, I mentioned that Florence Nightingale is a pioneer in nursing. Her impact is not just in Europe, but it definitely has an international effect. And now it is not seen as women, not seen as taboo for women to have a prominent place on the battlefield, thanks to Florence Nightingale's involvement. So let's move on to the peace terms of the Crimean War. So what's so confusing about so many treaties that end wars is that this, like so many others, is known as the Treaty of Paris, or I have here the Peace of Paris in 1856. So the war in total is about 3 years long. Really, the major takeaway is that Russia loses. Russia emerges as the clear loser at this war, and a lot of this is because of the peace terms, which I want to outline here. So first off, Russia has to surrender the territory that it was occupying near the mouth of the Danube River. So here's a little bit of a close-up. You saw some of them in previous maps, but the territories that they were occupying were Moldavia and Wallachia. These are now part of Romania. Um, now, Russia has to surrender these territories. The Danube River, by the way, is here. I'll talk about that in a minute. Um, also, Russia has to renounce its role as the protector of Greek Orthodox residents in the Holy Land, um, which is in the Ottoman Empire, as we already discussed. So that's really directly relates to one of the 4 points. Also, Russia has to return, I think I already said this, all the occupied territories in the Ottoman Empire. Yes, I mentioned that before. So Moldavia and Wallachia have to go back to the Ottomans. The Black Sea is made neutral. So this also relates to one of the 4 points, right? The idea, it's sort of two of the 4 points. First, the fourth one that says that there should be no Russian warships in the Black Sea, and also the one that says the mouth of the Danube and the Black Sea should be internationalized. All right, so that happens. Also, you're going to see that the independence and integrity of the Ottoman empires was recognized and guaranteed. So the Ottomans, which were declining leading up to the Crimean War, sort of see their power protected a little bit more after the Crimean War is over, thanks to their alliance with Britain, France, and eventually Piedmont. So this doesn't mean that the Ottomans really grow any stronger after the war's over, but maybe it slows their decline slightly. We know that they don't fully disappear until the outbreak, that is, of World War One. All right, so what's the aftermath of the war? What's the takeaway? Oh, one other thing I wanted to show you before I move on. This blue line here, I know that this map is a little bit smaller. It was the only way I could get it to fit here. Shows how big the Danube River is, right? So again, this was the territory that Russia was occupying, just this little bit here. But with access to the Danube, look at how much of Europe they can access very, very easily. This is Germany here in the green. All right, and also if they're occupying the Black Sea, that gives them easy access to the Mediterranean. So this was why Russia's actions beginning the Crimean War were seen as just as much of a threat to Britain and France as it was to the Turks. Okay, now moving on to the aftermath. All right, now one of the major reasons I already mentioned in the previous video why Russia loses is because it doesn't have the same kind of military technology that Britain and France do. All right, so it's like a huge red flag to Russia. We've fallen way too far behind in military power compared to the rest of Western Europe. And they really realize that when they actually are trying to put their military assets to use, and they just can't keep up with their enemies. All right, so very quickly after the Crimean War, Russia begins its move to industrialize and modernize its army. So if you remember from the Industrial Revolution chapter that we already studied, I gave like a broad timeline showing that, Britain is the first to industrialize, followed by France, followed by You know, you're going to see Germany and Austria. You're going to see that Italy is behind to a certain extent, especially the south, but that will catch up after unification. Now we see also Russia joining in. By the end of the 19th century, Russia is very much engaged in industrializing and catching up with the rest of the West, especially in terms of militarization. And another really significant thing that we see come out of the Crimean War is that the concert of Europe is no longer acting in concert. So, in other words, remember that the concert of Europe, Russia was part of it, right? Now we see countries that are also part of the concert of Europe actually fighting against Russia. So if they're not acting together, that shows us that their need to preserve the balance of power has sort of gone out the window. Russia challenges the balance of power when it occupies those territories on the Danube. And then when Russia loses and they're forced to renounce these claims, we also see the Allied countries wanting very little to protect any of Russia's assets. So, you know, the idea of a balance of power no longer really exists. And this is kind of a foreshadow um, to the next chapter that we're going to talk about. But we're also going to see if there's no more balance of power, that might lead certain countries to be a little bit more adventurous in terms of foreign policy. It might lead them to start to try to influence other countries outside of their borders, maybe try to establish an empire, which we will begin to refer to as colonialism. And eventually, this may also cause the outbreak of World War One. So that's kind of a synopsis of the Crimean War. Definitely important to know, even if it was not in the textbook, which is why I wanted to spend this one day talking about it. So hopefully that helped, and we'll pick up on it more in class.